Welcome to the silent personalities. In the final years before 1066, England stood balanced on a knife edge, prosperous yet vulnerable, unified in appearance, but strained by rival ambitions at home and abroad. At the center of this fragile moment was Harold Godwinson, a man shaped by power long before he wore a crown, whose fate would determine not only the outcome of a single battle, but the future direction of English history itself. His story is not merely that of a king who ruled briefly, but of a statesman and warrior who rose within an old political order and died defending it, just as a new one was about to replace it forever. Harold Godwinson, often called Harold II, was the last crowned Anglo-Saxon king of England, and his life and reign sit at the dramatic turning point between Anglo-Saxon and Norman England. He was born around 1022 into one of the most powerful families in the kingdom. His father, Godwin, Earl of Wessex, rose from relatively modest origins to become the most influential noble under King Siena, and later under Siena's successors. This background meant that Harold grew up at the center of political power, learning governance, military leadership, and court politics from an early age. By the mid-11th century, England was a wealthy, well-organized kingdom, but it was also fragile, with deep tensions between native English elites and foreign influences, especially Scandinavian and Norman. Harold first emerges clearly in the historical record during the reign of King Edward the Confessor, who ruled from 1042 to 1066. Edward had spent much of his early life in exile in Normandy, and his court showed strong Norman influence, which often clashed with the interests of the English earls, especially the Godwin family. Harold became Earl of East Anglia in 1045, and after his father's death in 1053, succeeded him as Earl of Wessex. This made Harold the most powerful man in England after the king. He controlled vast lands, commanded large military forces, and effectively acted as Edward's chief advisor. Contemporary sources suggest Harold was competent, decisive, and respected by many English nobles, though Norman writers often portray him as ambitious or deceitful, reflecting later political biases. One of the most debated episodes in Harold's life is his journey to Normandy around 1064 or 1065. The exact purpose of this trip is unclear and heavily disputed. Norman sources, especially those written after 1066, claim that Harold went to Normandy and swore an oath to Duke William, promising to support William's claim to the English throne after Edward's death. According to these accounts, Harold swore this oath on sacred relics, making it especially binding. English sources, however, are silent on such an oath, and some modern historians argue that if an oath was made, it may have been extracted under pressure or misrepresented later to justify William's invasion. What is certain is that Harold was briefly held by William, assisted him militarily in Brittany, and was eventually released, returning to England with his status intact. When King Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066, he left no direct heir. The succession was immediately contested. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle states that Edward, on his deathbed, entrusted the kingdom to Harold, and the Witnagement, the council of leading nobles and churchmen, elected Harold king. This process followed long-standing English tradition, where kingship depended on election and acceptance by the elite, not solely hereditary right. Harold was crowned on the 6th of January 1066, likely at Westminster Abbey, making his accession swift and politically decisive. From the English perspective, Harold's claim was legitimate. He was the most powerful noble, experienced in governance, and chosen by both the king and the council. However, Harold's kingship was immediately challenged by powerful rivals. Duke William of Normandy claimed that Edward had promised him the throne years earlier, and that Harold had sworn to uphold this promise. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, also claimed the English throne, basing his argument on earlier agreements between Scandinavian rulers and English kings. Harold Godwinson thus faced the prospect of invasion from both the south and the north, a rare and extremely dangerous situation. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada invaded northern England, supported by Harold's own estranged brother, Toasty Godwinson, who had been exiled after losing his earldom. Harold Godwinson responded with remarkable speed, marching his army roughly 300 kilometers from southern England to the north in a matter of days. On the 25th of September 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold achieved a decisive victory. Harold Hardrada was killed, as was Tostig, and the Norwegian army was almost completely destroyed. This battle is often seen as one of the most significant victories in English military history and demonstrated Harold's leadership, tactical skill, and ability to inspire his troops, yet this victory came at a terrible cost. Harold's army was exhausted and depleted, and within days of Stamford Bridge, news arrived that William of Normandy had landed on the south coast of England. At Pevensey, on the 28th of September 1066, Harold again acted quickly, marching his forces back south to confront the new threat. He gathered what troops he could, including the housecarls, his professional soldiers, and the local militia. Some historians argue that Harold might have benefited from waiting, allowing more troops to assemble and forcing William to move inland. But the sources do not clearly indicate whether delay was a realistic or politically viable option. The decisive confrontation came on the 14th of October 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Harold positioned his army on Senelac Hill, forming a strong defensive line with his infantry and shield wall. The English army lacked cavalry and archers, relying almost entirely on infantry, while William's forces included cavalry, archers, and infantry, giving them greater tactical flexibility. The battle lasted most of the day, unusually long for medieval warfare, and was fiercely contested. Several Norman assaults failed, and at points the Norman army appeared close to breaking. The turning point came when parts of the English line broke formation, possibly in pursuit of retreating Norman troops. William exploited these gaps, and repeated assaults gradually weakened the English defenses. Harold was killed late in the battle, though the exact circumstances of his death remain uncertain. Later tradition, famously depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry, shows Harold struck in the eye by an arrow and then cut down by Norman knights. Some historians believe he may have been killed by multiple wounds in close combat, and the arrow in the eye story may be symbolic, representing divine judgment or perjury in Norman propaganda. What is certain is that Harold's death shattered English resistance at Hastings. Without their king, the English army collapsed, and William emerged as the victor. Harold Godwinson's death marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule in England. Although some resistance continued for several years, William was crowned king on the 25th of December 1066, beginning the Norman Conquest. Harold's body was reportedly buried at Waltham Abbey, a religious house he had patronized. Though even this detail is debated in the sources, historically, Harold Godwinson has been judged very differently depending on perspective. Norman and later medieval writers often portrayed him as an oath-breaker, whose death was a just punishment. English sources and many modern historians view him as a capable and legitimate king, who faced overwhelming challenges in a single, catastrophic year. His reign lasted only about 9 months, but during that time, he confronted the major invasions and won one of the most decisive battles in English history before falling in another. Harold's life and death symbolized the end of one political and cultural order and the beginning of another, making him one of the most significant figures in English history, not because of how long he ruled, but because of what his fall made possible. Harold Godwinson's story ends not simply with his death on a battlefield, but with the closing of an entire chapter of English history. In standing against 2 foreign invasions in the same year, he embodied the final strength and traditions of Anglo-Saxon England, ruling according to its laws, customs, and political ideals at the very moment they were about to be swept away. His defeat did not erase his achievements or diminish his legitimacy. Instead, it marked the moment when England's past collided with its future. The Norman Conquest that followed transformed the language, culture, aristocracy, and governance of the kingdom. But it did so only after overcoming a king who had fought with determination to defend his realm. Harold Godwinson remains significant not because he failed, but because his resistance defined the end of an age, making him a lasting symbol of the last stand of Anglo-Saxon England. His legacy therefore lies not in the brevity of his reign, but in the scale of the transformation that followed his fall. Harold Godwinson stood at the threshold between 2 worlds, one rooted in centuries of Anglo-Saxon tradition, local governance, and collective kingship, and another shaped by feudal authority, continental influence, and Norman rule. The loss at Hastings did not merely replace one king with another. It altered the very structure of English society, from landholding and law to language and identity. In this sense, Harold became the final representative of an older England, one whose institutions had evolved organically over generations. His death sealed the fate of that system, ensuring that the future of the kingdom would be written by new rulers with different priorities and traditions.